Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for what promises to be an interesting conversation. Thanks to Marketing Manager Hannah New and Acquiring Editor Jedediah Rogers for arranging this event. Special thanks to authors Greg Prince, Steve Taysom, Richard Saunders, and Lindsay Hansen Park for gathering for this conversation on Mormon biography. Before we begin the conversation, I want to take just a couple of minutes to let you know that tonight's event is part of our full schedule of events celebrating the University of Utah Press's 75th anniversary. Thank you all for being part of the celebration. The press got its start back in 1949 when President A. Ray Olpin and others at the university turned the GI Bill and a general sentiment of support for returning soldiers into an expansion of the university, resulting in an area of unprecedented growth. Acting on the belief that a major university needed an affiliated publisher, the University of Utah Press was born. It was a time of opportunity in many ways. Dr. Charles Dibble and Arthur J.O. Anderson were hard at work on their English translation of the Florentine Codex, a monumental and encyclopedic study of Aztec lifeways and traditions at the time of the Spanish conquest. Their translation would require some 20 years and 12 volumes to complete and would become one of the press's proudest achievements. Closer to home, the Glen Canyon Salvage Archaeology Project helped create the University of Utah Anthropological Papers under the auspices of Jess Jennings. Publications in that series continue under series editors Brian Cotting and Elizabeth Lauterbach and have reached 138 volumes, many of which remain in print. The Florentine Codex and the University of Utah Anthropological Papers help make the more distant past present at the press, while nearer touch points remain among our Utah History and Mormon Studies titles. Hal Schindler's Orrin Porter Rockwell, Man of God, Son of Thunder, was published in 1966 and remains in print. Historian Juanita Brooks will always be a presence on our list. We look forward to Lindsay Hansen Park's forthcoming book. And Richard Saunders' recent biography of Dale Morgan is a new addition with deep roots in press history. Biographies of important figures in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, represented by Steve Taysom's Like a Fiery Meteor, The Life of Joseph F. Smith, and Greg Prince's David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, along with his biography of Leonard Arrington and his gay rights in the Mormon Church, fulfill important aspects of our mission to explore local history. New initiatives have an equally important place. We have 2 new titles forthcoming in sustainability studies, with more to come, and environmental initiatives are essential to our work, areas dear to the heart of Jedediah Rogers, whose own research examines those themes. Jed and Jeff Nichols helped to create the Utah series on Great Salt Lake and the Great Basin, a series dear to my own heart. Steve Sims' recent First Peoples of Great Salt Lake is the first publication in what will surely become an important series. And there you have the briefest of highlight tours of but a few of the press's publications and initiatives. We look forward to continuing with you the good work of publishing important books for the region and the world. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Jed Rogers, who will introduce our 4 authors for what is sure to be a lively conversation.
All right, well, thank you, Glenda. Good evening, everyone. It really is an honor to see assembled here who I would say are 4 of the most creative and interesting individuals working in Mormon studies. We have represented here past, present, and future. Future in the person of Lindsay Hansen Park for her forthcoming biography of Juanita Brooks, which we're now currently editing. And as Glenda noted, some of the University of Utah presses, she went over many of the publications that are significant to the press. Some of the most important ones happen to be biographies. And we're going to be talking about 4 of those that I think are among the, if not the most important that we've published. There are others that we could represent here. And of course, there are many other individuals who could be a part of this conversation. But tonight we've assembled the authors of among the best works in the field and in the genre. So here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to briefly introduce now each of the panelists, beginning with Greg Prince, whose biography of David O. McKay appeared first of those represented tonight. And then after introductions, I'll invite each of them in the order that I introduced them to take just a few minutes to speak about their work, and including how they came to it. And then we'll dive more deeply into some specifics. Gregory A. Prince. Greg, I'm going to pull from your wiki page. Many of us are familiar with you and your work, but you're an American pathology researcher, businessman, author, social critic, and historian of the Latter-day Saint movement. And then for our purposes tonight, I'll just say that you're co-author of David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism. If you can see my screen, here's the book. That was published in 2005. And also author of Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History, published in 2016, both of those award winners. Stephen Taysom is a professor of philosophy and comparative religion at Cleveland State University. He's author of Shakers, Mormons, and Religious Worlds, among other works. And then for our discussion tonight, and I don't have a physical copy because I have it in an ebook, his book, Like a Fiery Meteor, The Life of Joseph F. Smith, published in 2023. And then Richard Saunders is next. He's a librarian at Southern Utah University and author of a number of works, including for tonight's discussion, Del L. Morgan, Mormon and Western Histories and Transition. And then finally, Lindsay Hansen Park. It's a blogger, podcaster, executive director of the Sunstone Education Foundation. She has lots of exciting projects that she's involved with. For tonight's conversation, we're going to be talking about the manuscript that she recently completed on the life of Juanita Brooks, forthcoming with the University of Utah Press. So with that, Greg, take it away.
I had no aspirations to be an author, much less a biographer. I had no training in that field at all. My least favorite classes in high school and college were English and history, so go figure. But I got interested in early LDS priesthood by being an elders quorum president for 4 years. Had a lot of questions that my then fairly significant library didn't have answers to. So I spent 8 years writing Power from on High, the Development of Mormon Priesthood. That brought the McKay Project to my doorstep. I didn't go looking for it. The new mission president in DC, where we lived, Bob Wright, was not out of central casting for mission presidents. He was intellectually curious. We had him and his wife over for dinner a couple of times because we saw that they were kindred spirits. And in the course of one of those dinners, he asked me if I knew the name Claire Middlemas. I said, well, I knew she was President McKay's secretary, but that's about it. He said, she was my aunt. She left me her papers. She had intended to be his biographer, but had no time while he was alive. And after his death, her health declined rather quickly. So she never got around to this project. But she had spent 35 years chronicling his life in a way that may be unique among LDS church presidents. She wrote his 40,000 page diary. She did that in evenings and weekends, didn't take a vacation for 35 years. This was her heart and soul. So with the acquisition of the diaries, a copy of which she bequeathed to Bob Wright, that started us down that road. It was a 10-year project I had no intention of doing, but I saw the importance of it. And when those 100 volumes of 2-inch loose leaf binders arrived on my doorstep, I had some empathy for Joseph Smith and golden plates. because it was more a feeling of a huge burden rather than, gee, isn't this cool stuff? So that's what got me started. Not long after I got into it and saw basically what the diaries had, I put them on the shelf for a couple of years because it dawned on me that to give dimension to the biography, I needed the subjective memories that generally were not written down. So I embarked on probably a 3 or 4 year project of tracking down as many people as I could who knew President McKay and interviewing them on the record. Eventually, we got up to about 200 interviews. And that really set the stage for biography number 2 of Leonard Arrington, and then for the Gay Rights and the Mormon Church book, all of which relied heavily not just on documentary evidence, but on generating new history by going around and doing on the record interviews of people.
All right, thank you, Greg. So Steve jumped off. I think he'll be back. Richard, let's go to you, if you don't mind.
Oh.
Or Steve, you're here. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
I am here. I was trying to get a new link because I guess I'm just listed as a lowly attendee, which is fine. Could you repeat the question? I was busy tracking down my email.
Oh,
Blame it on Hannah.
Here we're on introductions. So introduce to folks your book and a little bit about how you came to it, please.
Yeah, my book is about Joseph F. Smith. It's kind of a very traditional, at least in its scope, traditional cradle to grave type biography. But I tried to weave in, I tried to look at it from the way that, what was he experiencing from his perspective, rather than from a kind of global looking down on him perspective. I came to the subject in a kind of couple of quirky experiences that happened. One happened early on in graduate school. When I read Scott Kenny's article about Joseph F. Smith in Sunstone. And I was fascinated. There was stuff in there I'd never heard about, violence, that kind of thing. And so it fascinated me because I hadn't heard that about him. I think a lot of people hadn't heard that about him. And then the other strange thing that brought me to him was as a incurable Beatles and John Lennon fan, I was fascinated by the fact that John Lennon has 2 sons by different women. And there was a dynamic in Joseph F. Smith's life whereby he was a half brother to a very different kind of man. And that got me thinking about him and what those dynamics would be like. And I thought it might be fun. I laugh because it wasn't, but I thought it might be fun to get in and do the work and find out more about him.
Thanks, Steve. We'll dig into that a little bit more. Richard.
Well, I wish I had a story that was nearly as interesting. I was a college student and talked with Chaz Peterson one time about fur trade, and he kind of turned around as he would and reached over his shoulder and pulled out a copy of Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West, and he said, if you're gonna understand the early West, you have to read this book. And so I did, and I was impressed, and moved to Salt Lake, or Bountiful actually, and for a while was working at the State Historical Society. And much to my surprise, I discovered that the author's brother lived down the street from me. And that kind of launched me out. And I realized that was just after Peterson's biography of Juanita had come out. And I thought, well, I can do that, as a callow grad student would normally think. And I've spent the past 32 years basically doing that. I realized very quickly that Morgan, as a deaf adult, and yet as a very literate man, had to write virtually everything. And so as I went through the Morgan papers at the Bancroft, first in person and then on microfilm, I struggled a little bit trying to make sense out of things and ended up spending a good portion of that time just trying to put stuff back into chronological order so that I could find out what was unfolding in his existence. Then I discovered that he only had about 2/3 of his material in among his own papers and went looking for other things. And that's when the real gold started coming up. And it's just been a long, interesting experience. I did a couple of other works about Morgan and his writing. But I think it's about time for him to be recognized as not a seminal figure, but certainly an important linchpin. He was Juanita Brooks' mentor. He was one of Leonard's first sounding boards. And by just his proximity to the bones of history, he started moving and pushing things in an interesting way that I think we're just now starting to see to fruition. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'll say that, he was certainly a mentor to many, and I think that you've sort of taken up that mantle. I remember you graciously sharing your several hundred page, I don't know, kind of index to his letters with me at one point. And so, yeah, hopefully his research and yours continues on. So thank you for that. Lindsay.
Hi. Well, I come from a family of genealogists. I mean, the women in my family, through both my dad's line and my mom's line, were always doing genealogy. It was almost as essential a domestic task as cooking and cleaning. There was always some sort of, you know, something on the table, a book open, someone was researching something. And so for me, that was just sort of what the women in our family did. And as I went on to blog, when blogs were a thing, I was instantly interested in history, but I had kind of grown up in a Kate Carter mindset. I was very familiar with the heritage-based histories of the DUP. My grandma's a DUP member. I would go to her meetings. I would help her with her talks that she would plan. And so for me, that's what Mormon history was. So when I started blogging and talking about the history and tying it to the future and the present, I got a lot of criticism. There were a lot of people that said, "You can't be talking about this. You can't do history. You're a mom." When we were blogging at Feminist Mormon Housewives, one of our big criticisms were like, "Sure, we were interesting and funny, but we were with our babies. We were changing diapers. We were talking about the domestic lives of women, while the other scholars were talking about the important stuff." And for me, this was the important Mormon story because I was living it as a faithful Latter-day Saint woman. But it was really challenging to have people tell me that I couldn't write history, that I couldn't participate in the conversation because I wasn't a classically trained historian, because my entire life that was the role of women in my community, and men too, but certainly in my life it was women. And it felt as tangible to me as anything else did. I mean, in our family, the past is very connected to the present. And so I remember podcasting for Feminist Mormon Housewives, and it was Joanna Brooks who had compared me to Juanita Brooks because I used to put my baby Violet, who is now, might hear her outside with all of her friends. She's 11 now, but she was a baby at the time, and she was sitting on my lap while I would podcast about the wives of Joseph Smith. And when she compared me to Juanita Brooks, I didn't know who that was. I thought it was her aunt. That's what I knew about her. Again, Kate Carter. That's kind of what I knew. And of course, what an honor now. I think Juanita Brooks would consider me wildly sloppy and would not appreciate that comparison because, I'm dyslexic. I put out a lot of content online, and Juanita was very careful. But it sort of opened up this curiosity about her, and Gary Bergera got me thinking about writing her. It's turned into a huge project, a very large biography that I've spent several years on. I've had the wonderful pleasure of talking with so many of her descendants and family members and children who are still living. Greg Prince was very kind in helping connect me. Greg knows her. He was, neighbors with her. And so it's really interesting to be able to talk about someone who isn't with us, but is still all around us. You know, she was someone who also a mother, also underestimated, also felt like she was never quite good enough, and told that often. I mean, Leonard Arrington, God bless him, he was so condescending to her sometimes, and I know what that feels like. And so while I can't compare myself in so many ways to Juanita because she was an excellent scholar and you know, an English professor, it is, there are some perspectives I think that add to the story of Juanita Brooks. Levi Peterson, of course, did an incredibly thorough biography that's almost like a ledger of her life, you know, what she did each day, and that was very useful. But I tried to write about the things that I think Juanita's life didn't talk about her, and I guess we'll answer that question in a little bit.
Well, Lindsay, I want to stay with you because for each of you, I wanted to sort of explore a little bit more about your personal connection to your subject, but particularly how that connection informs or informed your approach to biography. So I can imagine, Lindsay, that you have a kind of an affinity for Juanita Brooks, as many of us do. You were compared to her, but comment on your relationship, how your relationship to Juanita, how you negotiate this pole between affection and objectivity. You know, having affection, oftentimes biographers do have quite a bit of affection for their subjects, but yet you want to maintain sort of an objective approach. Was that your mindset, or how did you balance that, if so?
Yeah, I want to thank Amanda Komodo and Ben Park for really helping me understand sort of the current conversations on historiography. I can never say that word, and kind of how we approach our subjects. It's very hard to not fall in love with your subject, even if they're a bad person, right? I've heard that from a lot of biographers now. I think that what I tried to do was see her as clearly as one can, you know, reading correspondences and letters and only a paper trail left behind, and hearing the interviews, because she's become sort of a legend, you know, a local legend, and that adds to this patina of how we filter out what we read about people. Um, but what I did know about her was the things that connected with myself. And so that was the risk, was I would read things, and I think so many people like Juanita because they feel this way about her too. You read something that she says and you're like, I can relate with that. That makes so much sense to me. And I had to constantly be checking to make sure that I wasn't projecting, you know, my own feelings or experiences onto this woman who lived in a very different time period with very different circumstances. So that was a challenge. I'm a Levitt. I come from the same line as Juanita Brooks, and the Levitt family are hardcore historians. And so I also had to unpack some of the stories that I had been told about what had happened in Levitt family history. And so that was an interesting experience too. But really for me, it was the help of really good mentors who have invited me into the conversation and have understood, you know, the sort of reach that my platform has, and have helped me be more responsible with it and shape it into, you know, if I'm going to be telling these stories and people are going to be buying books that I write, let's get it to be as accurate and as thoughtful and as smart as possible. So that's what I've tried to do.
Thank you. Richard, going to you, it seems like, well, you write in your preface that you thought he was impressive, referring to Dale Morgan. So you clearly had some sort of an admiration, as you just mentioned. But I wonder, you've also had 30 years with the man. And so I think maybe it was just me, correct me if I'm wrong, but reading your introduction and epilogue, I couldn't help but think that maybe your views on the significance of Morgan had shifted, changed,
Yep.
even tempered over time.
Yep.
So maybe you could speak to us on how a biographer interacts with and interprets a subject when the project spans years, decades.
Well, first off, whatever you write at the beginning is going to be wrong or different by the time you get to the end of it. And I found a couple of things. There was a good chunk of one chapter that I remember I wrote sitting in a microfilm reader in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1995. But you know, the manuscript didn't actually hit the press until a couple of years ago. And so I had to go back and look to see if I was second guessing myself or if I had really gotten it right. I think part of the challenge for me over time is that it's impossible to distill lived experience into a few hundred pages. And so what one has to do, I think, is to choose what to remember and what to relate. There's no way to tell all the stories, much as we'd like to. But even a fair biography, or as best we can make, is always shorthand. It's always an abbreviation. And I think as long as we can remember that as readers, that there is no one single absolute definitive anything, then I think we go a long way, because we can approach Leonard Arrington or Juanita Brooks or anybody else from more than one perspective, and sometimes find a very different person than we thought we started off with. I gained a healthy respect for Morgan as a scholar. I lost a little bit of it because of choices that he made, promises that he made and just flat out never kept. And the way he would string people along, not intentionally. I think he had the best of intentions, but there are only 24 hours in a day, and one must both sleep and eat. And, here was a man that worked 16, 18 hours a day for years, decades, and never even came close to doing what he really wanted to tackle, partly because he was distracted by every interesting thing that came along. I think that was part of the challenge. And that distraction, while it produced some really interesting stuff, produced some that's less significant. And it's less significant because it was just for the moment or just for the contract or something like that.
Yeah, and then for you, Steve, I would imagine that your relationship to Joseph F. is less affection than these others that we've heard from. So what was your relationship to Joseph F., and how did that change over the course of the years that you worked on this project? And I mean, did he grow on you after a while?
It's like cancer, kind of. It was 10 years working on this project, and we might get into this later, but biography is a very different animal than history, and I'm a trained historian. And so, Richard was talking about the different people that we find ourselves studying over time, even though they're the same person. But it's not, I feel like I know less about him now than I did before I started, which is weird because I had that ignorance before I started, right? So I was trained in the seminars where we talked about the French postmodernists, we talk about archival traces, right? The only things that are left are these pieces of history that are preserved by accident or for some political purpose, propagandist purpose, and they're bound together by all the silences that are there. And so I was aware of that, writing about him, that if I were to spend 5 minutes talking to him, I'd probably throw the book out. It just would be different. But in terms of what I was able to glean from his life, I guess the thing, and I've gotten criticism and praise for this since the book came out. He did absolutely unspeakably horrible things, and he did truly tender, great things, and they're both part of this person. And I found myself, I was originally drawn to him by the fact that he had this kind of masculinity that I recognized growing up, as I did, the son of an Air Force officer. My oldest son attends West Point. I obviously didn't, but I was familiar with that type of person. And so for me, I wasn't shocked by some of the callousness and the the anger, the rage, that stuff I recognized. Didn't like it, but I recognized it. Not necessarily in myself, but I knew it. I'd seen people like that, and so I think that gave me a way in that wasn't so such a shock that I think it could be if you had just read devotional literature about this person, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with, you know, what he really was like. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that even in a world that was filled with what we would now think of as toxic masculinity, right? This masculinity of destruction and manipulation and rage, even at a time when that was sort of normal, he was beyond even that. So you had these other like masculine figures saying, "Wow, I think there might be something wrong with that guy. He's just too much." So I don't, I never really developed any kind of feeling for him, which is, I know that's strange and unusual as a biographer. It was just the way that I thought of it. I struggled at first to try to figure out how to fill a person-sized hole, because that's not how historians are trained to work, right? We're trained to ask a question, follow, the evidence for it, and try to come up with an argument. And so for me, I didn't really think about it that way. I didn't think about, is there a relationship that I have towards him? And so I don't feel any differently now than I did when I started, except that, as I said, I think I actually know him less well, or phrased another way, I know that there's a lot more about him I don't know than I did when I started.
Well, so just a brief follow-up. I mean, for all the difficulties that Joseph F. or the problems with the man, I mean, he presented some excellent fodder for a biographer? Would you say that? Is that the case? I mean,
Oh, there's no
I think we'll
question.
get into some of the areas in which you explore the some of the shadowy aspects of Joseph F. But is that a correct thing? I mean, there's just so much to the man that you had a lot to work with.
Oh, in fact, there was too much. I mean, that's why the archival traces thing was like, yeah, whatever. Those are not traces. Those are freight trains of archival leavings. If he hadn't been as interesting as he was, I wouldn't have finished the biography. There's just no way I would have done it. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the difficulty came in trying to figure out how do you tell stories that are happening on the same timeline, but that are not thematically connected. And so that's where, especially as he gets older, there's almost too much. So you have to figure out, how am I going to tell the story from, say, 1885 to 1895, 3 different times, right? Once about religion, once about politics, once about economics. And those are challenges that, as a historian, I wouldn't have had to face, because I just would have picked one.
Yeah. Yeah. And, for Greg, you had a problem of lots of material to work with. Not sure if you felt like your subjects were as complicated, maybe as Joseph F. But tell us about your relationship between biographer and the subjects of, 2 beloved 20th century figures.
I met and knew Leonard a bit. I never met David O. McKay. I grew up in Southern California. I was 2 when he became president. I was 21 when he died. But clearly, he was a towering figure to any of us who grew up in those years. We could hardly imagine what the church would be like without him, and I often wish we could return to those years. I think the McKay Church was a very benign and welcoming church, something that we haven't maintained since then. But I got into it not having any training in historical theory or biographical theory, so there was no template I was trying to put him into. What I did was what I did as a scientist. I've been an experimental biologist for 50 years. And what you do there is you do the experiments, you gather the data, and then you try to answer the so what question. The experiment had already been done with President McKay, but there were a lot of data to be gathered, What I did was to put 15,000 pages of primary source material into the computer from any direction that I could get it, including the interviews. And then over a period of probably 2 years, I did a cut and paste job on the computer and went line by line through 15,000 pages, started to build subject files. Conceptually, that wasn't too difficult. Logistically, it's a lot of work, but it's not difficult to say, all right, what does this sentence or this paragraph fit into in terms of a subject file? By the time I had finished, I had 100 files. But my approach, rather than going chronological, was to say what's important. And as I looked at those 100 files, 16 of them emerged as way more important than the others. And those became the chapters. I did not even try to put on paper chapter titles until I had finished the research, finished the cut and paste job, and done all of the accumulation of the subject files. I didn't need to, because then those files spoke to me. And there were 3 chapters, if I'm thinking about them correctly: correlation, broadcasting, and don't remember offhand what the third one was, that would have looked dry and unimportant to me in the beginning. It turned out they were some of the most important chapters. So I didn't bias myself going into it by trying to pigeonhole any of the data into preset subjects. I just let the subject speak to me, and that turned out to be a pretty good way of doing it. It also meant that each chapter could be read independently of the others without really having loose ends. People have said, well, that's not a traditional biography. No, it isn't, but it worked.
Well, that's a good segue into a little excerpt that I have from your introduction, Greg, where I think we're getting the sense that there are different approaches to biography. And Greg, yours in particular, given that you took a topical rather than chronological cradle to grave approach, it sounds like that's something, well, this is what you write in the introduction. You say, while we have attempted to write an analytical biography rather than merely a descriptive one, the analysis consists largely in ordering massive amounts of data into a coherent narrative that allows the subjects to speak in their own voices. Then a little bit later on, you say, where the data are silent, we have tried to follow suit. And it sounds like, that approach, do you feel like that's worked well? Has that approach allowed you to convey the message of David O. McKay and Leonard Arrington that you intended to convey to your audience?
Yes, let the data speak for themselves. If I could borrow from the title of a song a lot of Latter-day Saints learned in primary, follow the data. And that's never led me astray. So the data say he did this, he was that, fine, I'm okay with that. It didn't have to portray a burnished image. With David O. McKay and with Leonard Arrington, I didn't have to reinvent them at all. They had already established themselves as really important historical figures. So I could tell the story where the data told me to go with it, not always telling a story that was sympathetic to them. There were soft spots, there were blind spots in both men, fine. That was okay. And what really affirmed to me that that was a legitimate way of telling the story is the McKay family, which had had a long-standing reputation as not wanting anybody outside the family telling the story of David O. Of Ed in particular, saying in a public setting, I want to tell you how pleased the McKay family is with this biography. I spoke at Sunstone shortly after the book came out. It was a plenary session, so there were several hundred people there. Afterwards, a woman came up and introduced herself. She says, I'm Alice Wilkinson Anderson, Ernest Wilkinson's daughter. And I thought, uh-oh, here we go. Because I was not, I didn't give him a soft treatment. She said, I read your book. The first chapter I read was the chapter on education. And then she said, thank you, because you were fair to my father and other authors have not been. If you read that chapter, you see that Ernest Wilkinson does not come off looking like a white hat guy. He did a lot, but a lot of what he did was pretty damaging to people. To have her say that to me was the real validation that, yeah, you got this thing right. That's an appropriate way of approaching it. What I was trying to do in a lesser extent was to say the what, but the overriding concern was the so what. And if we could just distinguish between those two questions in anything we write or say for that matter, we'd be in a lot better shape. But very often we spend way too much time on the what, and we don't even pay any attention to the so what. As a scientist, if you're going to get anywhere, you got to be able to address that one. And that's what I did with the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go to the other three biographers here. Maybe Richard, beginning with you. I know just from conversations I've had with you that I can think of few people who have thought more deeply about the craft of biography and the different approaches, and including in your preface, or introduction, you mentioned some of those approaches, including the tell-all biography or the scholarly biography. Maybe give us a little bit of a sense for the different types of biography and then which you chose to tell your story.
That one's kind of tough because there's almost as many biographies as there are biographers. But generally, I think we've talked about the cradle to grave type. We've talked about the interpretive type. There's also ones that will just take facets, sometimes called a faceted biography. So you'll say, all right, here's so-and-so looked at through this lens. And I use the term lenses a lot with my students to say, what do you want to look and see out of this? I'd say in the time that I worked on this book of mine, I probably read 400 or 500 biographies, all the way from Italian news people to, Latter-day Saint faithful stuff, family history biographies. I've written a couple of my own, just family history. I realized, at least from mine, that Morgan was, and I think I put it in the introduction, that Morgan has fallen off the radar. And so I think I needed, or I thought I needed, before I turned it in, I decided I wanted to do a very traditional biography that was very much a cradle to grave. But I was interested in where he fits, or what Greg said is the so what. So my last chapter was me trying to say, what difference did he make? He didn't have any graduate students. He didn't have any academic chairs. He had nobody except his typewriter and his good friends. So he literally disappeared once he was gone. And so I decided, well, what is it? Where does he fit in the world that we call, society? And I think he does fit there. I think he fits there very interestingly. I think he became less of an interesting subject and much more of an interesting subject. I started off as a very callow graduate student thinking I can do this. And by the time I was finished, I was very glad that I had done it. Would I do it differently today? Probably, because I know a little bit more about him. There's some stories that just never got told because there's no space. But it's kind of one, Fawn Brody actually, in one of her pieces of writing, and she and Juanita and Dale were very, very best of friends. And Fawn said something to the like of, there is in biography basically a type of voyeurism, because the subject really doesn't get to choose except by what they have left, that silence in the archives, what is left and the story that is told about them. Now, partly that's a good thing, but partly it means that no matter what we do as a biographer, we're always filtering the individual. Jack Benson's biography of Wallace Stegner is a good example. It's a very good chronological, but it's a little more interpretive. It talks about Stegner in that case as a writer and what a writer means within this world that he inhabited. And I found that fascinating. Well, and that's kind of the way that I approached Morgan. Is it why is he doing all this tangential stuff? Because most of his output is not very significant, but it's most of his output. And the stuff he really wanted to be remembered for, he only finished one of them. He did some things along the process. I suspect Lindsay has probably already discovered that perhaps Morgan gave Juanita Brooks a third to a half of the source material that she used for Mountain Meadows Massacre, and told her that she had to footnote. It's the only book of hers that she actually footnoted, the only really work of history. And that is interesting, in seeing the interplay of minds, because Juanita is far better known. She was a far better letter writer. She's a much more interesting letter writer, even though Morgan had no real voice for most people other than his typed letters. But I'd far rather read Juanita Brooks's letters than Dale's anytime. You know, that'd be interesting to have someone do a collective biography of people through their letters. There's room for that. I think it hasn't yet been done.
Well, to that point, Lindsay, maybe we go to you, the way that you've crafted your biography. Obviously, Juanita left a lot of letters as well. To Richard's point, did you get a sense that Juanita was trying to curate the way her life would be remembered in the way that she was writing?
That's such an interesting question, because I think about that all the time. I think that growing up as an LDS person who was of the generation where we write everything in our journals, it was often me writing for who I thought would read it, you know, years down the road. And so I think that there's a very Mormon impulse there. Richard, I appreciate so much what you said about how every biography is different, because it really is the story that you tell. And you know, as Jed knows, in the last few years, I've been doing screenwriting, which is a completely different medium and craft. Telling Mormon stories on television, the narrative is far different than writing a historical narrative, and I've learned some really big lessons about that in the last few years. So I like a good story, and so I was torn between, oh my gosh, Juanita is so dynamic. She has curated sort of her life into these anecdotes and stories, of which she wrote about in her Quicksand and Cactus, but also she would tell, you know, at different lectures that she was giving. She would write it in her journal that way. She was very, very conscientious of that. In fact, I would say mortified if anyone ever saw the inner workings of her internal life. And unfortunately, we only have a few extant diaries of hers that she didn't destroy, because the one that she did destroy, ironically, here's a woman who, you know, is against destroying documents, is about, you know, sort of this transparency. She destroys her own journal because she is mortified of anyone seeing what she really thinks and what she really feels. And so, you know, I saw that, and I understood, I think, as a woman, that impulse. And she grew up poor. She grew up judged because of her poverty. She was laughed at Columbia, you know, for saying whoa, like she was pulling a horse when she was turning down an alcoholic drink. And I think that she felt this insecurity because of it. And so for her, decorum and this sort of propriety was the top priority always, because it brought her out of that poverty. It brought her out of that past, and it gave her a sense of credibility that I think that she felt like she lacked. And so I felt that impulse. I wanted to tell a good story, but then there's this other really nerdy part of me, and you can blame, you know, Brian Buchanan for this, but I also wanted to make sure that I was including helpful details to future people that wanted to know the story. And I was constantly battling between a good story, you know, thinking about, oh, Juanita would be mortified if she knew that I was writing about this in this way. And also, wow, it's really cool to have her homemade biscuit recipe included in the book, right? So because someone might want that someday. And so it was that constant tension for me. And I'm not I mean, time will tell how I did with that, but those were kind of the struggles that were always pulling at me.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you. So to you, Steve, I just have to say I was extremely impressed and deep by how deeply you interrogated your source material. And sort of the really rich analysis that you brought to Joseph F. And so, that I guess I wonder if I've got a quote from your preface or introduction in which you say, it's preface, you write, some periods in Joseph F. Smith's life are totally occluded. Others are available only through memories, and still others are known only through a combination of solid but spotty documentary material and informed conjecture. It is at these dark junctures where I have chosen to take excursions into theoretical or historiographical terrain. That's such a fascinating sentence. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the excursions that you took and why you chose to take those excursions as a biographer. Oh, your mic is on.
Of course it is. That's just a fancy way of saying that I had to put something in those gaps, right? There's all these lacunae that show up, and again, I can't undo. So you have to understand, I'm writing this. So we have to understand ourselves globally as we're people with all sorts of baggage, writing about people with all sorts of baggage. And so I was writing from the position of somebody who had just gotten tenure, was working on my second book, was teaching classes, was taking care of kids, having kids, getting a divorce. I mean, so there's all sorts of stuff that's happening. And what I relied on in those gaps was my historical training. Okay, so if I don't know what his childhood was like because there's no reliable sources for it, and we could talk about how my training leads me to as you said, interrogate the sources. If there's nothing there, I know that there are scholars who've written about what a childhood, for example, in the American West in the 19th century would have been like. So that's one of the examples, right? Where I kind of go on these sort of, call them excursions. I might choose a different word if I were to write this again, but that's kind of what I mean. And I do the same thing in the Hawaii chapters. It's very difficult to understand what he's experiencing and what he's talking about without understanding the broader historical things that he's in the middle of. In fact, things that he wasn't necessarily even aware of. He would mention, I met a Calvinist or I met so-and-so, not knowing the history of Hawaii, not knowing what had just happened. It had essentially been stripped of its traditional religiosity. And then every type of Christian sect had rushed in there. He didn't know that. But I had the luxury of 100 whatever years of historiography to look at and say, this is what he was in the middle of. And then that helped me to make sense of what he was going through, but it also helped the book along because it added, I do think it added some texture to the otherwise broad scope of his life. Because one of the problems, Richard talks about reading 400 or 500 books about biography. I don't think I read that many, but I realized very quickly that I was naive going into this. I thought, well, I'm a historian and a biography is just a history of a person. And that sounds ridiculous to me now. It's such a different field. And so I spent 2 years probably reading and looking at all the different ways that you can put a biography together. And it's funny because Greg talks about being, a very traditional kind of let the facts speak for themselves. But his published work is in fact quite an innovation, right? To write like that is not to separate things out and to put them like that. That's not typical. The strangest one I ever saw was a biography of Thomas Edison. It is not that old. I don't remember who wrote it, but it was actually written backwards. from the time of his death up to his, I don't think they went all the way to his conception, but it went, pretty close. I don't remember what you asked me originally, but that's got to be the answer. Oh, you want to know about the excursions? Well, there's one.
Yeah, I think you answered it. That's interesting. So we've seen lots of different approaches. I want to pivot a little bit and try not to have the impulse to be too modest here, because all four of you are selected for the significance both of the subjects that you write about, as well as the significance of the works that you've produced, or in Lindsay, your case, that is forthcoming with the press. But I want you to comment on the place and impact of your work on the field of Mormon studies. We talked about how biography is not history, but there's some overlap. But still, biographies make a major impact, in my view, on the field of Mormon studies. And I wonder if you could just reflect on that. Greg, maybe starting with you. Your book has been out for 2 decades. What impact do you see that your book has had, and was it the intended impact that of course, you couldn't have necessarily anticipated fully, but give us a course for how the book has been received and its impact in the field.
I don't know what its impact on the field of Mormon studies has been, because I've always been on the fringes of that community. I've had other callings in life, primarily that of a scientist. For the last 4 years, I was traveling every month to St. George, heading a biotech company there. And every month I'd have breakfast with Steve Snow. Steve was the church historian from 2012 to 2019. And at least a dozen times he has told me that new general authorities would come to him wanting reading lists so that they could get up to speed. And that didn't surprise me, because they're not selected for their depth in Mormon history. Most of them are paper thin in that. But he said, I always put your book at the top and said, read this, because this will tell you how the church functions. And to me, that's the home run. It wasn't something I had anticipated accomplishing, but that's the effect that it's had at that level. I heard from somebody, I don't even remember who it was, who was at a private gathering with Russell Ballard of the Quorum of the 12, and he made a comment about the McKay book, and he said, it's a good book, but I wish he hadn't written it, because it tells how the sausage is made. To me, that was a compliment.
Sounds like a compliment. Well, for the other 3 of you, Richard, Lindsay, Steve, what kind of impact would you like your work to have on the field of Mormon studies, on biography writ large? What kind of impact do you anticipate, or did you aspire to have?
Well, I'll throw myself in there. I'll tell you exactly why I ended up writing this book the way I did. And that is because Juanita Brooks has always been given the sorry.
We will be closing in 15.
Sorry, that library's closing.
Get out of there.
I've been just a little irked that Juanita Brooks has been kind of drawn in to the pantheon of Mormon writers, and she wasn't the origin, and she was a beneficiary more than she was an origin. I've been always interested, partly because of my training in modern American history, but I've been much more interested in the 30s through the 50s, the predecessors to Leonard Arrington, because, it didn't suddenly change from Joseph Fielding Smith to Leonard Arrington. There was a big, interesting, and kind of messy sausage making that was happening during those years that nobody has really approached, and that really interested me. I wanted to know why it was that, number one, Leonard Arrington would come quite literally hat in hand to a librarian in California for criticism on some of his early Latter-day Saint writing. But what I found was that a good proportion of early scholarly writers on Mormon history from the 60s 50s and 60s, did exactly the same thing. They came to Morgan because everybody had to go to Morgan. He was a giant when it came to this beginning of documentation and these new questions that were being asked. I found it fascinating that Morgan was pushing for a deep investigation into contemporary documentation. We have actually gotten to the point in the church historian's office and other places where we're finally actually doing that. We're going back to the documents and seeing what they said and then telling the stories, rather than starting with the faith first and then seeing where it can take us. So I was really interested in that transitional generation. Nels Anderson, who actually got Juanita Brooks interested in things, Dale Morgan, Stanley Ivins, and a number of other people, Bernard DeVoto, of course, Fawn Brody as well, because I think that their stories have been left out of the mix as we have focused too much of our attention on the scholarly aspect of Mormon history. We forget that lived experience and different varieties of storytelling are also part of the historical narrative. So that was my motivation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Lindsay, do you want to sort of respond to that and also give your perspective?
Yeah, I do. I propose a new segment where we do some like biography cage matches where Richard and I put our Dale and Juanita in the ring and just have them go at it. Because Richard, I have to say, I absolutely adore your work and respect you. And don't give Dale all the credit. He wasn't digging in the attics for everything, right? Like it was this ecosystem of historians, and so that's my defense of Juanita there. But I think that Juanita does have a legend and a myth around her, and I would say, you know, if we're doing word association and I say her name, most people are going to say Mountain Meadows Massacre. That's what they think, and that was just one part of a large part of her story. I mean, to me, one of the most heroic things she did a lot of them in her lifetime. One of them was employing women in her stake who were starving during the Great Depression. She was so resourceful and so smart and always strategic, looking for win-wins for people. And she found a way to not only get herself paid, but the women in her stake digging up these histories. We have women, speaking of, you know, people that we don't hear about in this time period, like Richard was mentioning, Mabel Jarvis. You hardly ever hear that name at all. That woman was digging in attics with Juanita. They found over 450 pioneer journals and transcribed them by hand on a typewriter. Like, that is very hard work. And I just think that that's such a beautiful story. I mean, she saved so many historical properties. I think the climax of my book is going to be when she faces down as a woman standing in a room of all ecclesiastical leaders and politicians of power. As someone who grows up as a woman challenging, you know, my own culture, sometimes I don't think many people know what that feels like. And so, you know, Juanita did that, and I think that that shows her character. So for me, the legacy of what this story is, I hope that Juanita's story gets told over and over again. I'm really interested in both her legend, her mythos, and the human, you know, that she seems to be. I think both are very interesting and both have so much to offer the world. And so I really think that, you know, this is my generation's attempt to do that, because I found her story so remarkable in its sort of abstract, like feelings of just the boredom and the normalcy that she lived. One of the things, I'll just say this and then I'll move it to someone else. When I'm talking about the history of Mormon polygamy, we're always talking about sex, right? And I always feel like that's centered on a male perspective. That's considering the male's experience with Mormon polygamy. That's not a woman's experience. Most of her time is spent in boredom, in the in-betweens, in the, you know, cooking for her family, and people don't find that interesting as, you know, what's going on in the church office building. And to me, that's what goes on in the church office building is only one tiny, tiny sliver of Mormon history. To me, what's going on in people's kitchens and living rooms, their day-to-day, that's really important. And yeah, I hope I've written it in a way that's accessible. So it's outside of just the academic community, but I want my mom's book club to read it, who did read it for me. They were in my test kitchen, and that was a good experience for me.
So, Lindsay, you mentioned just a quick follow-up because you mentioned these other women who are digging in the archives. Women, I mean, I'm not sure who they are or what their names are. Do you feel like Juanita Brooks sort of represents them? And are you trying in your manuscript to highlight other lives as well as Juanita, kind of in a broader sense?
Yeah, like Dale, I mean, or sorry, like Richard, I am so interested in this cohort of people, of contemporaries. I mean, it's interesting because at Sunstone I have the opportunity to see sort of generations of these people and to observe the patterns and kind of the interactions. And I always think like, gosh, you know, everyone loves Juanita now. History has sort of rewritten her in a really interesting way. And now everyone in the church historian's office has a copy of her book on their shelf, right? They cite her in their footnotes. That is crazy to think about. Because if Juanita said what she thought and she said it on Facebook today, they would take that off their shelves. Like she had some pretty spicy opinions about things. And I don't know. I feel like she is so translatable to now, and I think it always will be that. And so I think that sort of transcends time and space because her stories, like these women, are part of her story. And so in the biography, you'll hear a lot about Dale Morgan. I call them, you know, she called him her intellectual companion. And I think he was one of the great loves of her life, truly. Their letters back and forth are so lovely. Like it was such a delight to read them. And I struggled. Ben Park disagrees with me on how much of a quote to leave in because I just felt like they said it so well and they said it so good. So the men there, Fawn Brody certainly makes an appearance, and I think she had an interesting, complicated relationship with Juanita. And Maureen Whipple was a contemporary who was a brilliant writer who they were mean to. They talked behind her back all the time, and I guarantee every scholar has their back chats where they do the same thing. I've seen it. So it's interesting to see it in the notes. And yeah, these women in her ward and in her life that she was also trying to lift up. Roxy Romney is one of them. They make an appearance too because I think that I'll just say John D. Lee's granddaughter, Eddie Lee. I had no idea that she was partially responsible for kicking off the foster care movement in the United States. Like people don't know that about her. She had this incredibly powerful life, and I had no idea till I engaged Juanita's work.
Thank you. And then to you, Steve, what kind of an impact would you like that your work, I mean, did you anticipate or maybe that you would like to see that your work has in the broader field of Mormon studies?
So I've been engaged in this for a while. In the inaugural issue of the Mormon Studies Review out of the Maxwell Institute, which the essay they told me they just barely were able to publish it, which I take as a compliment. I said Mormon Studies was really just aspirational. This was about 2007. That we hadn't moved beyond really the kind of logical positivism. I mean, history moves in phases, right? And it matures and stuff. And you get to the point where and Arrington was kind of working this way, and all the people who worked under him were working this way, which and people at the root, it's sort of a us versus them kind of thing underneath all of this work that's gone on for many, many years. And logical positivism is just the idea that that there's a reality out there, and if we just collect enough pieces, we'll be able to see what it is, and everybody will agree on what it is. Well, that's not true. Okay, that there is no puzzle to be put together that everybody's going to agree on. And so one of the things I hope the book does is suggest, maybe obliquely in some ways, that we can get away from that idea. And I think there's been a lot of work that has moved us past this, that a book does, in its simplest form, I can express it this way. A book about someone like Joseph F. Smith does not have to be either an indictment of his character or an endorsement of his character. It has nothing to do with his character, any more than, well, I use that analogy, but if we could move past that, I think we're going places. And, it's interesting to watch the reaction to the book, mostly on message boards. There's only been a couple of published reviews yet, but I've been accused of obfuscating, and then they will list all the things that I wrote in the book that he had done, which, if you think about it, is incredibly bizarre, because if I was obfuscating it, they wouldn't have the list because it wouldn't be in the book. We've got to get past that. If Mormon studies is going to be a thing, we have to move in terms of our sophistication beyond that. And that doesn't have anything to do with formal training or not formal training. I mean, there's all sorts of ways people can contribute to this work. And I hope that this book, I don't think I have an ego big enough to say that this should be a model or a template or anything like that. But it could suggest, as the work of everybody else on the panel, it's true of their work too, that there are multiple ways of coming at this, none of which necessarily speak to anyone's position within the broader cultural world of Mormonism, if that makes sense. I mean, so for a long time, you would, I can remember being at BYU, 30 years ago, and somebody would say to me, I'd have a Mormon history book, Mike Quinn or something like that, and they'd say, they'd be interested in it, but then they'd ask me, is this person active in the church? By which I think they mean, are they loyal to the institution? And I just said, why don't you put that away, that idea? We can talk about it later. I just read the book. And even after they read the book, a lot of them couldn't really figure it out. I mean, they didn't know. I think if we can ever get to that space where we're not always kind of having this weird feeling inside, like it's still very much inside baseball, Mormonism, Mormon studies. It's still an insular kind of, everybody knows everybody kind of small group, which is fine. But we need to learn to put our work in conversation with work that's outside of what we're doing, if that makes sense. And I mean, you can already see with Richard and Lindsay, the conversation that they're having about these figures, right? That's the kind of stuff that we need to do, right? Is to have these conversations, not about, well, is it true or is it not true? Is it faith promoting? Is it not? It's, who cares? I mean, some people do, obviously, but these conversations are the ones that matter. And as we move along and mature, and people take the chance to write more books like this, and they're not worried about what the church is going to do, because the church seems to be more or less, kind of hands off at this point. The more we do that, the more we'll grow as a field, as a respected field, and the more other fields will be able to communicate with us and understand what we're saying.
Steve, I think that's well put. I want to give space for these others to comment. Greg, maybe you could say a few words about the future directions of Mormon studies and the place of biography within the field, and any advice that you have for aspiring biographers who, are maybe looking to contribute.
I would echo what Steve said. I look at the field of Mormon studies. I look at the endowed chairs of Mormon studies, and I don't see much interaction with the broader world. Those look like enclaves. They're fairly insular, and I don't see those scholars in an ongoing dialogue with other scholars outside of Mormonism. That's the bridge I think we have to be able to build. I don't know if we'll get there. I don't know that Mormonism has become enough of a thing that anybody else outside of it much cares about it. Maybe when they spoke of the Mormon moment when Mitt ran for president in 2012, they were right. It was a moment. And then the world went on.
Lindsay,
If I could just
Richard.
add, oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Steve.
Just
No,
that,
please.
That
Please.
just reminded me when I went up for tenure, we get letters, we get external reviewers, right? They send our work out to people who are outside, and I had a book and a bunch of articles at that time, not this book. But one I was struck by one of the, and they show later on, they show us the letters, and this guy had written back and said, this reminds me of, his description of Mormon studies reminds me of what Catholic studies was, when I started. This guy he's now passed away. He was quite old then. And he described it. I mean, it was a kind of a ghettoized, insular sort of, this is what matters, is just what's in here. And then probably in large measure because of Vatican II in the early 60s, that sort of broke open. I think if we keep at it and keep asking the right questions, we'll get there. If we keep chasing our tails about who's orthodox enough to and who isn't, and have some weird continuum about because I can remember being as a graduate student being told don't present at Sunstone, don't present at Sunstone, don't publish in Dialogue. Of course I did all that stuff because that's just if you tell me not to do it, I'm likely to do it. But the idea was I know people who now work for the church who avoided that stuff. I think if we can get away from that, we'll be better off. And I think I'm going to make a recommendation to the church because they care what I think. But the more we write, the more sophisticated work we write, the better the church will look, because it will look sophisticated, it will look textured, it will look like it has depth, it will look like it produces thinkers. The people in the past won't be cardboard cutouts. One of the things that emerges in the Joseph F. Smith book, my Joseph F. Smith book, is that this is not an easily pigeonholed individual, but it's fascinating to study things like he's probably, and I studied his vocabulary as it grew, right? And I looked at, because there's ways you can study vocabulary. How many words does he know? And my study yielded the fact he knew more words than any other general authority of his time except Orson Pratt. And that's fascinating to me, right? Because it isn't just about, well, they're general authorities. Well, they are, but they're also these individual people with individual personalities, right? And when you compare him to his brother John, who wasn't winning any vocabulary bees or anything like that. I mean, he would refuse to pray in general conference when Brigham Young asked him to. It's those sorts of things that are so fascinating to me. To say nothing of the darker parts that show up.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Before Lindsay or Richard, you chime in, I just want to tell those attending that neglected to say that you're welcome to enter a question into the Q&A. We have 10 minutes left, so hopefully we can get to a few questions, but put it in the Q&A box at the top of the screen. And so yeah, please enter any questions that you might have.
Jed, can I say something about the faith politics? Is that okay?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
The questions, I think what the state of Mormon studies is so interesting to me, because I actually think there are people telling Mormon stories outside of Mormonism. And it's filmmakers, right? We see a lot of true crime. We're the true crime genre now. Christina Rossetti, who is a non-Mormon Mormon scholar, jokes that Catholicism is, you know, the horror brand and Mormonism is the true crime brand. We've kind of brought that on ourselves. And I think, you know, some of the writers like John Krakauer, he's not a historian, but if Mormons are upset that he's the one getting the most play on his books, that he's winning at, you know, sort of expanding the story to more people, then we need to just be more trustworthy in our telling of the history. And what I mean by that is, I agree that we react in shame to the truth about who we are, which is a complicated human people. We're very diverse. We have a lot. We all do it. We all want to present a certain way to ourselves. But I think, you know, at learning so much storytelling with the telling of Mormon stories, I find it so inefficient when we try to hide the humanness of this tradition. It's just a bad story, and that's why we're not winning with it, right? Because you know, the stories that are interesting are ones that have some complexity to them. Now, are there ways that storytellers exploit Mormonism and make it more salacious? Of course, we can tell a story anyway, as Richard Saunders said. However, I think that some of the best, most heartfelt work, the work with the best soul in it, is one that finds a way to do both, to tell something as close as it is as possible and let those things stand. And so I think that Mormon studies will get there, but you know, we still are not nice to non-Mormon scholars who are studying us. We need them. We need the outside perspective. You know, I have learned that some perspectives I have in my community, my LDS community, there's some bad things that are so normalized in our thinking. We don't see it till someone points it out. And I'll just give you an example. I love to make fun of the Mormon Battalion before anyone gets upset. Let me just say, I think it's funny that they're so persecuted, like that the fact that they're wearing pants made out of hickory, right? They're dyeing hickory pants. They walked till their shoes fell off and they walked till they were bleeding. And I had to hear about that all the time. And Christina Rossetti said to me, have you heard of the Civil War? Like, you're not unique, you know? And it took outside perspectives to sort of, you know, shake me out of my Mormon thinking of like, we are the most persecuted. We are the most that. No, we were just people having an experience at a certain time. So that's my comment about Mormon studies.
Jed, can I jump in?
Oh, please, Greg.
I'm on the Board of Governors of Wesley Theological Seminary in DC, have been for 6 years now. When I was first getting to know the seminary, I went golfing with the president one day, hoping we would just have a chance to get to know each other. The third tee, he said, okay, so tell me about Mormonism. By the time we got back to the clubhouse, he said, you people have an interesting story. You should be at the table. And I said, David, the problem is we have yet to acknowledge that there is a table. Later, Marlon Jensen came back for lunch at the seminary because I wanted him to meet the people there and to have them meet him. And during the lunch, one of the theologians said, Elder Jensen, we have wanted to have LDS scholars at the theological table, but we cannot find any who know the vocabulary. And Marlon stiffened momentarily, and then he said, you're right, and it's our fault, and we have to fix it.
I think this is a valuable conversation. I'm going to pivot here to the Q&A. So Amanda Hendricks Komodo writes that as part of this conversation, you discussed your relationship with the subject of your biography. I wonder about your relationship to their family members. This could be for anyone, but I'm thinking in particular of Steve's biography of Joseph F. Smith and how he navigated Joseph F. Smith's treatment of his wives. Did he feel a responsibility to Joseph F. Smith's first wife, Elvira? Steve?
I don't know that I felt a responsibility as much, I mean, except in the sense that it's part of the documentary record that must be explored. And yeah, I mean, I did take some satisfaction in I wasn't the first person to do this. I mean, this has been people have known about this, but in bringing it, amplifying her story, because in all the subsequent publications by the church and by faithful historians, um, she's just disappears like Lilith, right? In the Hebrew story, right? She's just gone, and a different first wife shows up. What was it besides his relationship with her? You wanted to know about? Was the question?
Yeah, how he navigated Joseph
Oh,
Smith's treatment of his wives.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of descendants, and I've heard from a lot of them.
Mm.
And it is like they are as diverse as you could possibly imagine. I've talked to people, descendants of Joseph F. Smith, who are, what we think of as Orthodox Mormons, right? I mean, just wear their church clothes on Sunday and so on and so forth. And I know a transgender person who's a descendant of Joseph F. Smith. And one of the things that they all have in common is they all know that they're a descendant of this person, and it means something to them. And so one of the things I've never had anybody say to me that was a descendant, and I've talked to probably 100 of them, I've never had anybody say, you should have said this, right? They're always appreciative, and it's like somebody else mentioned, they're always appreciative of the fact that they know this person better than they did before, because they didn't know him before. I mean, they're so removed from him, they're getting a different version of him. And so when they see, and Joseph Smith, talking about sources, he was always very, very cautious in his journals. Wrote very little from the early 1860s on, very little in his journals, but his letters are absolute treasure troves. I think because he didn't think those letters would survive. In fact, he often says, burn this, and they ignore them. But the descendants have always been appreciative. And I was surprised by that, because I thought they wouldn't be, actually. Or at least some of them wouldn't be. And maybe they're not, but I haven't heard from them.
Yeah, Richard, we have 1 minute, but not too many descendants of Dale Morgan, right?
No, he never married. Died just before his engagement was actually formalized. But he had a very, very interesting relationship with a close friend for a very long time who became positively poisonous. I had a hard time trying to tell her in a good light, because her letters are so cutting and so harsh, and it's always his fault. So, I had to choose very carefully, because he is obviously the subject, but I had to choose very carefully what to tell. He was careful about his own relationships, and he didn't choose to keep most of the correspondence with his closest friends. He just didn't do that. He only sent his correspondence from people that he was interacting with as a professional, pretty much.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's 8 o'clock. We have another question that I'm just going to pose. At least maybe you can answer in your own mind. But I think that it says, how can scholars in Mormon studies do a better job at writing their books with a non-Mormon audience in mind? I think we've addressed some of that, but I think that we're at a closing point, right? I mean, is there any last final words, very, very briefly, 15 seconds? Then we'll close up.
Let me just toss one out that I can say, answering Scott Barrett's question. I think we need to kind of de-jargonize Latter-day Saint language and actually define what we mean, and kind of explain a little bit. Now, that may seem pedantic in some respects, but never presume that your reader is as familiar as you think that they should be. We all need to understand a background, and backgrounds are different at different times and places.
I
Yeah,
laugh
and
at
you
that
have,
because my friend
oh, sorry.
Stacy, who's in the chat, she read through it and her edit was that I said in particular a lot. You find those phrases that you say, and some of them are Mormon, so I like that feedback.
I submitted an article on Mormon exorcism to the Journal of Religion and American Culture. And I got it back, and the feedback was, it's great, but we don't understand. And then they had a list of words, right? Like, what does this mean? What is this? And they're all LDS technical terms, right? And so I had to go through and explain them. And sometimes it's even, the confusion is compounded because we borrow words like sacrament. And a Catholic reading that is like the sacrament. You only have one thing that you do, like, and so it's confusing, and so you end up with, you know, usually a lot of footnotes or something like that. But yeah, you do absolutely that. We're in that place, as Greg said, where we have to learn to speak that language. And I think one of the things to do, and it's not the only thing to do, but one of the things to do is we're sending out a lot of graduate students, a lot of LDS people going to graduate school, and graduate school will teach you the vocabulary of these various faith groups. Now, you don't have to go to graduate school to learn that, but it's a really good way to do it. I don't recommend going to graduate school, by the way. I know it seems like I just did, but do not do it.
Well, I just, on behalf of everyone in attendance, thank you so much for your insight and this conversation. It's been really fun. It's great to see all four of you. Glenda, thank you for thoughts on the 75th anniversary of the University of Utah Press. Here's to 75 more.
Yeah, thank you.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you all. What a great event. Thanks.